The man who needs nothing is society's greatest threat, not because he's violent or dangerous, but because he can't be controlled. Carl Jung discovered that when a person achieves complete psychological independence, they become immune to every system designed to manipulate human behavior, and that terrifies those in power. Picture this scene. You're walking through a busy city center. Everyone around you is rushing, scrolling, buying, posting, performing. They're chasing promotions, likes, validation, the next purchase that will finally make them happy. But in the middle of this chaos, there's one person who's completely still. Not because they're lazy or checked out, but because they've found something that makes all that noise irrelevant. What I call psychological sovereignty, the state Jung described when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." This person has done something that threatens every corporation, every political system, and every social media platform on Earth. They've stopped needing external validation to feel complete. But here's what makes this so dangerous to those in power. Our entire economic and social system is built on what I call the dependency loop. Every advertisement, every political promise, every social media notification is designed to keep you in a state of perpetual want. Jung observed this pattern in his patients over and over again. In his work, The Undiscovered Self, Jung warned that mass society functions by keeping individuals unconscious of their true nature. He wrote, "The individual has always been unconscious of himself and has remained so. The mass takes care of this automatically. But what happens when someone breaks out of this unconsciousness? What happens when they achieve what Jung called individuation, the process of integrating all parts of the psyche to become a complete, self-sufficient individual? They become what I call the ungovernable man. And that's exactly what scares the system." Carl Jung spent decades studying the human psyche, and he made a discovery that changed psychology forever. He found that most people live their entire lives wearing what he called the persona, a mask designed to fit in with society's expectations. Jung described the persona as a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. Most people become so identified with this mask that they forget who they really are underneath. But Jung discovered something else. When a person begins the process of individuation, when they start peeling away these false layers and integrating their shadow, their anima or animus, and finally connecting with their true self, something remarkable happens. They stop being controllable. This is where it gets dangerous for the system. Jung's most radical insight was about what he called the shadow, all the parts of ourselves we've been taught to reject or hide. He said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Here's what I call the shadow paradox. Society teaches you to suppress your anger, your selfishness, your dark impulses. But Jung discovered that when you deny these parts of yourself, you become enslaved to them. You need constant external validation because you're terrified of being seen as bad. But the man who has integrated his shadow, he's done something revolutionary. He's looked at the worst parts of himself and said, "This is also me." He's not controlled by shame because he's already faced what he's ashamed of. He's not desperate for approval because he's already approved of himself, the good and the bad. Jung wrote, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. But once you make this effort, something incredible happens. You become immune to emotional manipulation." But Jung's process doesn't stop there. After integrating the shadow comes what I call the inner marriage. Jung discovered that every person carries within them the seeds of their opposite. Men carry an inner feminine principle he called the anima, and women carry an inner masculine principle called the animus. Most people project these qualities onto others. Men look for the perfect woman to complete them. Women look for the ideal man to make them whole. But Jung found that when you integrate these opposing forces within yourself, you stop needing someone else to complete you. Jung said, "The meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow. The shadow is a tight passage, a narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared who goes down to the deep well. But one must learn to know oneself in order to know who one is." When a man integrates his anima, his capacity for intuition, emotion, and nurturing, he no longer needs a woman to access these qualities. When a woman integrates her animus, her capacity for logic, assertion, and independence, she no longer needs a man to feel strong. This creates what I call the complete individual, someone who is psychologically whole and therefore impossible to control through promises of romantic completion or gender-based marketing. Finally, Jung discovered the ultimate stage of psychological development, contact with what he called the self. Not the ego, not the persona, but the totality of who you are. Jung described the self as the archetype of wholeness and the regulating center of the psyche. When someone reaches this stage, they've achieved what I call inner authority. They no longer look outside themselves for guidance because they've found the source of wisdom within. They don't need gurus, influencers, or experts to tell them how to live because they've connected with their own inner compass. Jung wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." The awakened person is the most dangerous person in any society because they can't be sold a dream. They're already living their truth. Now here's where it gets really interesting. When someone achieves this level of psychological independence, the system responds in predictable ways. They label you as selfish, antisocial, or dangerous. They try to shame you back into dependency. Jung observed this pattern in his own life. When he broke away from Freud and developed his own theories, he was ostracized by the psychological establishment. When he refused to conform to academic expectations, they tried to discredit him. But because he had done the inner work, their attacks couldn't touch his core sense of self. This is what I call the immunity factor. When you've integrated all parts of your psyche, external criticism can't destabilize you because you've already faced and accepted your own darkness. You're not perfect, but you're complete. And completeness is far more powerful than perfection. Let me show you exactly how dangerous this is to our educational and institutional systems. The entire structure depends on what I call the expert dependency model. Every institution is designed to make you believe you need someone else's authority to understand truth. Can't understand psychology? You need a degree. Can't make decisions? You need a guru. Can't find meaning? You need a religious leader. The message is always the same. You are not qualified to think for yourself. But Jung's individuated person has achieved what I call inner authority. They've developed their own capacity for critical thinking and don't outsource their judgment to experts. Jung wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." They question everything, including Jung's own teachings. They understand that true wisdom comes from integrating external knowledge with inner knowing. They're not anti-intellectual, but they refuse to substitute someone else's thinking for their own psychological development. Jung himself warned against this kind of intellectual dependency. He said, "Thank God I am Jung and not a Jungian." The individuated person learns from teachers, but never becomes a follower. The threat extends beyond economics into politics. Political systems depend on what I call the savior complex, the belief that someone outside yourself can solve your problems. Vote for me and I'll fix the economy. Follow this ideology and you'll find meaning. Join this movement and you'll belong. But Jung's individuated person has done something radical. They've taken responsibility for their own psychological development. Jung warned, The mass-minded man, as an extension of his own personality, sees his personal experience confirmed by politics. But the individuated person doesn't look to politics for personal validation. They understand that external change must follow internal change. They're not waiting for the perfect leader or system to save them because they've saved themselves through psychological work. And that makes them immune to the fear-based messaging that drives political engagement. Nowhere is this threat more visible than in our relationship with social media. These platforms are designed around what I call the validation addiction, the constant need for likes, comments, and shares to feel worthy. But Jung's individuated person has achieved something that breaks this entire model. They've developed what Jung called a personal relationship with the unconscious. They don't need external validation because they're connected to their own inner source of worth. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But once you do this inner work, the opinions of strangers on the internet become irrelevant. You're not performing for an audience because you're not seeking their approval." This creates what I call the attention drought. When someone stops feeding the algorithm with their need for validation, they become invisible to the system. And a population of people who don't need likes and shares threatens the entire social media economy. But perhaps nowhere is this transformation more threatening than in relationships. Our entire dating and marriage culture is built on what I call the completion myth, the idea that you need another person to make you whole. Jung had a different vision. He wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But this transformation can only happen between two people who are already complete within themselves. The individuated person doesn't enter relationships from a place of need, but from a place of wholeness. They're not looking for someone to fix them, complete them, or save them from loneliness. They're looking for someone to share their completeness with. This creates what I call the conscious partnership, a relationship between two sovereign individuals rather than two needy halves trying to form a whole. And this kind of relationship can't be exploited by industries that profit from relationship dysfunction. Now, I need to address something crucial here, what I call the spiritual bypass. Many people hear about Jung's ideas and try to skip the hard work of integration. They want to be enlightened without facing their shadow. They want to be awakened without doing the psychological heavy lifting. Jung was clear about this trap. He said, "The most dangerous thing is to interfere with a natural process of development. You can't think your way to individuation. You can't meditate your way around your shadow. You have to do the work. This work involves what I call the dark night of the soul, a period where you confront everything about yourself that you've been avoiding. It's not pleasant, it's not Instagram-worthy, but it's absolutely necessary." Jung wrote, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." The individuated person has made this journey and emerged psychologically complete. The integration process, 12 to 13 minutes. So how does someone actually achieve this psychological independence? Jung outlined a specific process that I call the 4 pillars of individuation. First, shadow work, identifying and integrating the parts of yourself you've rejected. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." This means looking honestly at your anger, jealousy, selfishness, and other negative emotions instead of suppressing them. Second, animus integration, developing the opposite gender qualities within yourself. For men, this means embracing your intuitive, emotional, receptive side. For women, it means claiming your assertive, logical, independent side. Third, persona recognition, understanding the difference between who you really are and the mask you wear for society. Jung warned, "The persona is a fictitious personality. It is a mask that an actor wears to project himself in a role. The key is wearing the mask consciously rather than becoming identified with it. Fourth, self-connection, establishing a relationship with what Jung called the archetype of meaning. This is your connection to something larger than your ego, but found within your own psyche. Let me give you practical steps to begin this process, what I call the daily individuation practice. Start with what I call shadow spotting. Every time you judge someone harshly, ask yourself, what quality am I rejecting in myself? Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Your judgments are clues to your own shadow. Practice what I call persona flexibility. Notice when you're performing for others versus when you're being authentic. Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." Start experimenting with being more genuine in low-stakes situations. Develop what I call inner dialogue. Jung discovered that the psyche naturally wants to communicate with consciousness through dreams, fantasies, and intuitive insights. Start paying attention to these internal messages instead of constantly seeking external input. But I need to warn you about something. As you begin this process, you'll face what I call the conformity pressure. Family, friends, and society will try to pull you back into your old patterns. Jung experienced this himself when he broke away from conventional psychology. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But becoming who you truly are often means disappointing people who are comfortable with your false self. You'll be called selfish for setting boundaries. You'll be called difficult for refusing to play games. You'll be called antisocial for not participating in meaningless social rituals. But remember, these reactions prove you're on the right path." Comment if people started treating you differently when you found your backbone. They sensed the change before I announced it. The system only resists what threatens it. If your growth towards psychological independence is making others uncomfortable, that's evidence you're breaking free from their control. One of the hardest parts of this journey is what I call the authentic loneliness. As you stop performing for others, you may find that some relationships were based on mutual performance rather than genuine connection. Jung warned about this. He said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. When you start accepting yourself completely, you realize how many people in your life only accepted your persona." But here's the paradox. This loneliness is actually freedom. You're no longer surrounded by people who only like you when you're pretending to be someone else. You're creating space for authentic connections with people who can love your real self. And most importantly, you're developing the most important relationship of all, your relationship with yourself. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." This requires being willing to be alone with who you actually are. As you progress through this process, something remarkable happens. You experience what I call the power shift. Instead of trying to get power from external sources, approval, status, control over others, you start accessing your own inner power. Jung called this self-actualization. He wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens. The awakened person doesn't need to dominate others because they've mastered themselves." This creates what I call quiet authority, the kind of presence that doesn't need to announce itself. People sense that you're operating from a different level of consciousness. You're not reactive, you're not needy, and you can't be manipulated. If you've reached the point where you can read people but no longer need their approval, write, "I see you, but I don't need you." This is what makes you dangerous to systems of control. You've become what Jung called a conscious individual in a world designed for unconscious masses. But here's what's really threatening to those in power. Individuation is contagious. When people see someone living authentically, it awakens their own desire for authenticity. Jung observed this in his practice. He wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But the transformation only happens when at least one person is operating from their authentic self. This creates what I call the authenticity virus. One genuinely individuated person can inspire dozens of others to begin their own journey towards psychological independence. And that's how systems change, not through revolution, but through evolution of consciousness." Jung also warned about something else, what he called the collective shadow. When large groups of people refuse to do their individual shadow work, they project their darkness onto scapegoats, other races, political parties, or nations. He wrote, "The individual has always been unconscious of himself and has remained so. The mass takes care of this automatically. But when individuals start doing their own psychological work, they stop participating in collective projections. They can't be manipulated into hating the other because they've integrated their own otherness. They can't be scared into giving up freedom because they've found security within themselves. This makes them immune to the fear-based messaging that drives political manipulation. One of the most beautiful aspects of individuation is what I call the creative explosion. Jung discovered that when people connect with their authentic self, they naturally become more creative. He wrote, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity. The individuated person creates from inner necessity rather than external pressure. They're not trying to impress others or gain fame. They're expressing their unique perspective because it's their nature to do so. This creates what I call uncorrupted art, creative expression that can't be bought, sold, or controlled by market forces." Jung realized that individuation wasn't a new concept. He found the same process described in wisdom traditions around the world, from Christian mysticism to Eastern philosophy to indigenous shamanism. He wrote, "The individual has always been unconscious of himself and has remained so, but in every culture there have been those who achieved consciousness. These individuals became the wisdom keepers, the ones who couldn't be controlled by temporal power. This is why authoritarian systems always target the wise ones first. They represent an alternative to external authority, the possibility of inner authority. And that's the ultimate threat to any system based on control. In our digital age, individuation is more important than ever. We're bombarded with messages designed to keep us unconscious. Social media algorithms, targeted advertising, polarized news cycles. But Jung's individuated person has developed what I call psychological immunity. They can navigate these systems without being controlled by them. They use technology as a tool rather than being used by it. They're not addicted to notifications because they're not seeking external validation. They're not triggered by political content because they've integrated their own shadow. They're not manipulated by advertising because they know who they are and what they actually need. The individuated person also has a completely different relationship with money and material possessions. Jung wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. When you're clear about what you actually value, you stop buying things to fill psychological voids. You understand the difference between wants and needs. You're not impressed by status symbols because you know they're just external markers of inner insecurity. You're not afraid of losing material possessions because your sense of worth isn't tied to what you own. This creates what I call economic freedom, not having more money, but needing less to feel complete. And someone who doesn't need to consume constantly is a threat to consumer capitalism." Jung also discovered that individuation has profound health benefits. He wrote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. When you stop running from your psychological truth, your body stops manifesting that avoidance as illness. The individuated person experiences what I call psychosomatic harmony. Their mind and body are aligned because they're not constantly fighting internal conflicts. They're not stressed about maintaining false personas or suppressing authentic impulses. They sleep better because they're at peace with themselves. They have more energy because they're not wasting it on psychological defense mechanisms. They age more gracefully because they're not fighting the natural process of life. Finally, Jung discovered that individuation prepares you for what he called the final individuation, death itself. He wrote, "Shrinking away from death is something unhealthy and abnormal, which robs the second half of life of its purpose." The individuated person isn't afraid of death because they've already died to their false self. They've experienced what I call ego death, the dissolution of the persona and the discovery of something deeper and more enduring. This gives them a quality that's both peaceful and powerful. They're not clinging to life out of fear, so they can live more fully. They're not avoiding death through denial, so they can embrace each moment more completely. So here's my challenge to you. Stop waiting for the world to change and start changing yourself. Stop looking for external saviors and become your own hero. Stop seeking validation from others and start the process of validating yourself through inner work. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." This is your invitation to claim that privilege, to become dangerous to systems of control, not through rebellion, but through psychological independence. Start with one small step. Notice one way you're performing for others instead of being authentic. Question one belief you've never examined. Integrate one aspect of your shadow that you've been rejecting. Remember, the man who needs nothing from the system becomes immune to the system. And in a world designed to keep you hungry, wanting, and dependent, that's the ultimate act of rebellion. If you recognize yourself in these transformation patterns, write this. My breaking point became my breakthrough. The man who needs nothing is society's greatest threat, not because he wants to destroy anything, but because he can't be controlled by anyone. He's done what Jung called the work of a lifetime. He's become who he truly is. And once you've tasted that level of psychological freedom, you can never go back to being unconscious. You've become what Jung called a conscious individual in a world of unconscious masses. That's your power. That's your threat to systems of control. And that's your gift to a world that desperately needs people who can't be bought, bullied, or broken. If this resonated with you, and you want to dive deeper into Jung's psychology of the rare individual, check out my video on the rare aura only true empaths carry, where I explore Jung's insights into the highly sensitive person who sees what others miss. The journey to psychological independence starts with a single step. Take it today. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.